Perfect. And I'm really, really excited and happy to introduce Joanne and Blanca, who will introduce themselves a bit more in a few minutes. But yeah, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Hopefully it's the correct presentation that appears on the background. Lovely. So hello everyone, and thank you very much for attending this webinar about working with MS. My name is Blanca de Dios Perez, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Nottingham, and I work on supporting people with MS to remain in employment and developing programs from the perspective of research. And I will ask Joanne to introduce herself as well.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Joanne Hurford. I'm an occupational therapist. I work at the National Hospital for Neurology, and I've been the lead occupational therapist for our vocational rehabilitation team since 2012. And in our team, we have occupational therapists, psychologists, and a neurologist. So yeah, we see a lot of people with MS in our service.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, Joanne and I bring different but complementary perspective from the research and the clinical practice. And as a brief overview for today, we ask you some questions, some preliminary questions, and we will address them today. Then we will cover the research into MS and work. Joanne will give an overview about the experience, how this translates into practice, and then I will share a few examples of vocational rehabilitation interventions or programs to help people with MS to remain in employment that have recently been tested in research. So now I will pass the presentation to Joanne.
Thank you. So we asked you, what are your main concerns about MS and work? And what would you like to learn about this for this webinar? And we had some lovely comments back. And essentially the main themes were around like what recommended reasonable adjustments would they be, how you manage invisible symptoms in the workplace, how you advocate for yourself without kind of shrinking, like looking like you're shrinking your responsibilities, how you might manage a lower immune system in a complex office situation, and kind of taking sick leave, and then could you be terminated for taking time off? So we've given those questions some thought, and we've embedded them in the presentation with some speech bubbles you'll see. But if there's any other questions at the end, then we'll be gladly happy to take those for you. So we also wanted to ask you another question right now, and we wanted to kind of kick off with like, why do you think work's important, and what do you think the benefits of work could be? And we're happy to take comments in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, or you can use Slido. And I can see one already, so thank you, Nick. Kind of provides a sense of purpose. Anything else coming up? Learning new skills, absolutely. Independence and freedom, and that's kind of like financial independence, I guess. Anything else? I definitely benefit from the structure and routine of having something happening. Okay, normality, yeah. Meeting people and being around colleagues, yeah. It's got a huge social element to it, and people really noticed that in lockdown, didn't they? Sense of purpose, finance, independence, the people, careers, aspirations, yeah. And actually there was a nice article that like what is good work, and it identifies lots of these as being the key things, and having a good line manager and having autonomy. Perfect. Doing something you love and gives life meaning. Perfect. So there's lots of research as well that talks about the benefits of work, and so Blanca's going to take that bit over.
Yeah. And yes, you have illustrated many of the things that are positive about work, and we know overall work is good for health, not only for economic reasons. It gives us a sense of purpose, finances. It has. We know that people who are employed have better physical health overall, but there's also research into the impact of MS, work in MS, and the benefits of working. And we know that from recent research, actually, that people with MS who are employed, there is even a difference in health outcomes for those people who are working full-time compared to those working part-time. So people working full-time had better walking ability, less fatigue, and lower levels of depression or mood difficulties than those who were working part-time. And again, we know that work is good when you continue remembering deadlines and completing complex challenges. It helps with your memory and thinking. So those who are unemployed tend to have poorer memory and thinking ability. And of course, it's good for economic reasons, self-image and social confidence overall. And this has all been studied within the group of people with MS. And what do we know about MS and work? So we know people are diagnosed at a very young age, between 20 to 40 years of age. And at this moment, there are over 150,000 people with MS in the UK. Unfortunately, we know that after 10 years with the condition, fewer than 50% of people with MS remain in employment. And this decreased to 20 to 40 after 15 years with MS. We also know that in the UK, 41% of people with MS remain in employment compared to 81% of people without disability. So this is having a huge impact, and we need to be able to do something, because we know that most people with MS, if their workplace is adapted, they are keen and eager to remain in employment, and this can be done. But at the moment, we do not understand what works, and we don't have that many services offering this support. So we need to understand this a bit better in order to support people with MS at work. And we have this page with different quotes just to get an overview of the experiences that overall people change the way they do things. You need to approach your job in a different way to manage your fatigue, to ensure you remember to meet your deadlines. Some people might feel a little bit less confident if you are experiencing these difficulties and not addressing them, or you feel your employer is not being supported. It can be quite challenging because work is difficult overall. So if on top of that, you need to ensure your colleagues actually understand what fatigue is or what MS is, it can be quite difficult to continue working and keep motivated. As an overview of the common difficulties that people with MS experience at work, we divide it usually in 3 groups. The first one is about the symptoms. So we know that 90% of people with MS mention fatigue as a challenge. Memory and thinking difficulties are also very common, and especially if you're fatigued, your memory and thinking ability might get a little bit worse as well because they interact with each other. Depression, because if you don't feel accepted or understood at work, and the progression of MS can be difficult to manage. Then we have the work environment. So when your workload is unpredictable, the office is too hot or too cold, the distance to travel to and from work can also be challenging, and you may reach to the office already exhausted. And the final one that I find most interesting and complex is the attitudes of people. So not everyone understands MS. They may not know whether you have MS or not. There may be a lack of support from the coworkers because they don't understand the condition, and there's the attitudes toward disability. All of these factors can cause difficulties to remain in employment. However, although all of this may seem like this picture is creating a negative picture, the reality of it is that the MS symptoms play a small role in the challenges to remain at work, and this can be adapted through rehabilitation and support. And actually, the interaction between these symptoms plus the, for example, lack of support in the workplace is actually what creates most of the challenges. But fortunately, we have vocational rehabilitation, which has many definitions, but we usually define as a process whereby those affected by illness or disability are unable to remain, return, or find new employment. It's basically providing tailored support to those who want to work to continue to do so. And because there's not two people with MS who are the same, this support can be very different according to the stage. So newly diagnosed people with MS may just want some advice about disclosure, so telling your manager that you have MS. There might be others who have been living with MS for a few more years and need advice managing symptoms or changing the way they do their job, restructuring the job. People can find themselves in a work crisis, so you might have had a relapse and be off work over several months. There might be some performance monitoring and different challenges that people can experience over their working life. And finally, those who are not working but are keen to return to work, and they might need some advice about how to re-enter the workforce. And fortunately, there are services like where Joanne works, where they have loads of experience in addressing some of these challenges and offering support. And now we move to, from the research, we know some of the challenges, but what are we doing in practice?
Thank you, Blanca. So as Blanca said, it really is like there's no one size fits all. It really is like a tailored individual kind of program that we would be looking at with the individual depending on their needs, but also like the demands of their job, because there's a real difference between like the job demands. So I'm first going to talk about the Equality Act, because that's a real thing that kind of underpins what we do. So the Equality Act came out in 2010, and it puts the onus on the employers to make reasonable adjustments for disabled job applicants, employees, or former employees. And what they're saying is they want to develop a level playing field. So I always use this picture on the side here about equality versus equity, because you may be in a situation where you're asking for working from home, and the line manager may say, well, if I do that for you, I need to do it for everybody. So equality is not about doing the same thing for everybody. It's about doing what's right for you and making it equitable for you. So you can see here in the first picture, you've got a tall, short, and a middle-sized person all standing on the same size box. So that's everybody being treated equally. But as you can see, the shorter person cannot see over the barriers. If you give someone kind of an extra leg up, maybe an extra day from home, it enables them to do what they need to do and engage in the football game that's happening or the baseball game that's happening. So you can see there that you don't need to be equitable, but if you want to be really equitable, then you take all the barriers away for everybody. So that we can see here that workplace inflexibility contributes to the higher rates of job loss experiences by disabled people, and that was a study in sort of 2021. You might want to ask, like, what's a disability? Well, under the Equality Act, we have 3 conditions, MS, HIV, and cancer, that are automatically covered at the point of diagnosis, regardless of their symptoms. So you may be having relatively mild difficulties, but you would still be covered under the Equality Act. But for other conditions that are not listed, then they basically need to have long-term symptoms that last for more than 12 months and it have significant impact on day-to-day functioning. So next slide. So probably what I wanted to say then is, before we go on to talk about it, has anybody in the kind of group here thought about telling their employers or not telling their employers? What are the pros and cons of disclosing versus not disclosing? Any thoughts? Do people have a preference to one way or the other? Yeah, so Nick says disclosure can get you the support you need. Get the support you need. Yeah. And it's a real personal decision. Some people choose to disclose to one employer, and some people may not choose to disclose to the next employer. Any cons? Being discriminated against. Yeah, and that kind of depends on the relationship, doesn't it, that you feel like you've got with your line manager or your colleagues around you. Louise, I can see you've got your hand up. Please feel free.
So unfortunately, in my situation a couple of years ago, I worked for a corporate company in the beauty industry. It was a chain across the UK. And when I went forward with it, there was coincidentally a person there at the same time who was pregnant. And all of the reasonable adaptations were made for her, but mine were dismissed. It ended up in me leaving and there was a legal situation involved, but sometimes the lines get blurred because I would assume the lack of understanding or the ignorance or the unwillingness to learn. But she, the pregnant girl, had all of the the adaptations and different things, but they were not applied in my situation, unfortunately.
And
So
may I
sometimes it's a very complicated. I mean, it's the law, but it's a very complicated situation sometimes when people don't want to understand or don't understand.
Yeah. May I ask how the legal situation panned out for you in that situation?
With so I signed an NDA, but I came out on the better side.
Okay, I'm glad to
hear that. And I am in a much better position now in my career. So I've left that industry, but I'm in a better place. So
thank you for sharing that with us. It does sound like a difficult situation. I'm glad that you came out of it in the better side of things, but it's really difficult, isn't it, to perhaps demonstrate. So if you, I think perhaps we'll go on to the next slide, Blanca. So officially, you are not required to disclose a health condition to your employers, unless you're perhaps in the armed forces, driving a vehicle, or your condition puts other people at risk, and then you do need to. That's like a requirement of your job. And the employer should not be asking you about your health or anything like that. They can send you to occupational health, but that doesn't necessarily mean to say that that information goes back to your employers if you don't want that to be shared. But we do know from the literature that disclosure earlier on can be very helpful, and that disclosure is often associated with greater physical disabilities rather than cognition. It's often associated with working with an employer for a longer period of time, like, looking at the kind of personal connection to the employer. And so it was an Australian study where they said that early disclosure can be helpful if followed up with reasonable adjustments. Again, I say that, but there are different industries that you work in that you might have different experiences. So if you're self-employed, we're not able to kind of gauge what other people are going to do with that information. So it is a very personal situation to you. And there's some really nice information on the MS Society website. And perhaps if we go down to the next one, that really talks about, if you're thinking about disclosing, who are you going to share that information with? So it might be that you just want to share it to occupational health or HR and not your line manager if you don't have a good relationship. And like, when are you going to tell them? Perhaps like you might not tell them during the interview process if you're going for an interview, and you tell them once you've been offered the job, or you might have been working for the organisation for years and just been diagnosed. Is that a good time to tell them, or do you wait until perhaps you've had a change in symptoms and really relapse? So it's very personal for everybody, but I, perhaps from working with lots of people with MS, see that if things are relatively stable at this point in your life and you don't need too many reasonable adjustments, then it can be a good time to disclose, because you're still able to kind of work in a very efficient way with that information being shared. If you share it later on down the track, they might be thinking, why haven't I told you that before? But again, it's very, very personal to the individual. It's also important to think about, so we've talked about the who, the when. It's also important to think about what you're going to disclose, and that again is up to you. You don't have to tell them that you've got MS. You could just share a neurological condition. You don't have to tell them about all the ins and outs of your symptoms. You might want to share some and not the other. And how, and so you might want to do the how through an email, or you might want to do it through spoken word in a casual kind of meeting. We've certainly done some work with individuals where it might feel, if you've recently been diagnosed, it might feel really uncomfortable to share that information without becoming upset. So we might do some role play with somebody just to kind of go through like rehearsing that of like what you're going to say and when. Blanca, I can't really speak and see the comments coming up, so please do shout if we need to address any of them coming up. So if you choose not to disclose, that's okay. Under the Equality Act, if your employer is seeing you having difficulties, so for example, you might be working on a work site and you might have a limp or difficulties walking, they should still be making reasonable adjustments for you based on the fact that they can see you having difficulties walking. They don't have to know that you've got MS. But if you choose not to disclose, you might not be protected from discrimination. Your employers may not be making reasonable adjustments for you in the same way as if they did. You might be breaching indemnity insurance, or you could be breaching health and safety. It does depend on the nature of your job and what those requirements are. But it's just important to kind of think, you know, probably for an office job, it's not going to impact on all of those things. Yeah. So next slide, please, Blanca. So what the equality does not protect you against is if there's redundancies happening in the workplace, you will be put in the melting pot with everybody else, and you should, you know, your job will be considered in the same way everybody else is. So it won't protect you there. The employers need to make sure that they are following correct processes though, and that it's happening on a wider scale than just your one job. So they do need to make sure that they're following processes. The employer, if somebody gets to a point in their career that there's not a good job match and they can no longer do this job that they had initially set out to do, then you hear the words redeployment come up sometimes. Now, the employers are not necessarily required to redeploy you to a different role or to find you an alternative role. Under the Equality Act, they are required to make reasonable adjustments for the job that you've got here and now. And if people are not able to perform their job, so for example, if I had a scaffolder that had balance issues and he couldn't perform his job, you know, working at heights in a risky situation, then they could look at performance managing that person out of the job. However, before they go down the performance management route, if they are aware of the person having MS, then they need to make sure that all the reasonable adjustments are in place. If the employers do not know that you've got MS, then and the person is being performance managed, they can stop the performance management process by disclosing and making sure that all the reasonable adjustments are kind of in place first. So yeah, so those are the three things that are not covered by the Equality Act. Next slide. What is reasonable? Well, this is a legal question for the courts about what's reasonable, and it will be again decided on an individual basis. And the types of things that the courts will consider is the size of the company. So if you were working in a small solicitor's firm and there was just 2 or 3 of you and some admin staff, then there may not be quite as much onus on that organisation to be making as many adjustments like to workload and stuff like that as there would for like a huge organised like international organisation like Marks and Spencer's or something like that. So the size of the company matters. Also, they'll be looking at the impact for the employee and the employer. So if we're saying, if I was kind of writing a letter and said this person needs to have 50% of their workload or their work targets kind of removed, that might not be reasonable because that would have a financial impact for the employer, or it might impact on the other employees that they're kind of working with. So they do look at that. But if it was, for example, like working from home, where the job could be done 100% remotely, then that wouldn't, you know, be an issue that should be considered. If there are associated costs with the reasonable adjustments, I mean, you know, employers should be putting in money to support with this, but, you know, it might look at like what the costs are. Ultimately, it's when we write to employers as therapists, we put forward the suggestions, but it's the employers that kind of hold the upper hand with deciding it's reasonable. And then if there's a dispute about that, then it would go to the courts and the courts would decide it's reasonable. But we don't very often get that to that case. So yeah. So workplace social support reduces stressful working conditions. Sorry, someone's just coming in. Sorry. Yeah. So moving on.
Yeah. I'm just going to mention from the chat, John, that someone wrote that the term reasonable was the biggest challenge for me in my employment situation. It is too subjective. And I think this slide really helps to know how difficult it is to define what is reasonable on a case-to-case basis.
Yeah. And in an ideal world, you'd have a list of things that were considered reasonable, but we don't have that. And that's because it is really individual to the person. So the reason it's really individual is because we need to be thinking about these kind of three domains. So we've got in the bottom corner here, we've got the person. So as Blanca already spoke about, like the person is about their skills, their symptoms, their interests, their values, like that. This is all kind of what makes up this person. So you've got this person that sits here, and obviously the MS is where that sits and how that impacts on you. Then we're thinking about the work environment, and that may include things like the social cultural environment. You might get some environments where people just don't stop for lunch and they work all through the time, or you might have busy, noisy work environments that make it too difficult for you, or it might be a natural work environment where you're out and about. So, you know, those are all actually, because when we think about the environment as well, we might be thinking about their social policies as well. So we know that in the banking industry, lots of people quite often have like corporate insurance policies. The NHS is very kind of like process driven with their sickness management procedures, whereas other organisations might be a little bit more relaxed. And then in the top bit here, we've got the job demand. So this is where the job match kind of comes into play. So you might have a taxi driver that if they had physical difficulties, like say mild lower limb weakness, they could still do their job. But actually, if they had some visual changes which would affect their safety being on the road, then that would make it really difficult for them to kind of sustain that. Equally, you know, there's lots of examples where you might be, again, a chef with MS, heat sensitivity, fatigue, and it'd be a real trouble kind of working in the kitchen. Whereas if that same person moved to like an administrative job, that was more of a cognitively demanding role, then there may not be an issue. So it is a real kind of individualized case for the person, the environment, and the jobs. That is where we kind of think about it for you. And we know from the literature and Blanca's literature here that employers are more likely to support their employees if they have a better relationship, but also like a better understanding of MS as well. So, and accommodations are generally associated with kind of longer time in work. So here are just, when I am thinking about reasonable adjustments with employees, like I say, it's very much tailored to them, but there's these 4 categories that you might be thinking about. You might be wanting to look at a change to the job. So it might be adjustments to their performance targets, the complexity of type of people that they work with or cases they take on. You might be asking for, you know, some people, we might be saying, actually, this individual works much better with longer projected projects rather than the short projects that require like high demands and stuff like that. Or, you know, in healthcare, you might be saying this person can no longer do on-call or night shifts, or, you know, you might be saying this person can't work at height. So it depends if it's an essential part of their job as well, or potentially redeployment if it's a large organisation. Other reasonable adjustments might be about changes to the environment. So you might want technology, assistive equipment, or just looking at the office setup. If you're in a big open plan office, do you want to look at where the desk is located? Do you need to have access to the toilet, stairs, those types of things? Or you can be looking at things like help from others. So we can talk about access to work in a minute, but we know that this scheme is amazing, provides travel support, mental health support, equipment and assessment, and support workers. But you can also have things like workplace support. So you might want regular meetings with HR or your line manager, more training, mentoring, or you might be asking them to think about how they communicate to you or support cognitive strategies. Again, it depends on the issues that are the most prevalent for you. Or finally, you might be wanting to think about adjustments to the management policies, procedures like working from home. You know, it doesn't need to be the same as everybody's. Flexible working hours, like earlier start and finish times, so you're not using public transport at the rush hours. Yeah, so those are just some examples, but we can talk about more at question and answer time at the end. If we just move on. Already mentioned access to work. So this is what it looks like. It's a government funded, non-means tested scheme. It used to be the easiest thing to kind of all the benefit systems to kind of navigate. But since COVID, unfortunately, their waiting times have gone up. So you need to make a self-referral to access to work. It's about a 12 to 24 week wait at the moment, and you need to make sure that you have your national insurance number when you go on to kind of register yourself for it. But the support involves taxi support. So if you're working central London and really facing a hot tube feels quite overwhelming, then they will give you a taxi to and from work. It will, however, minus the usual costs that you would pay for your taxi to and from, or your train fare, and then they top up the rest. You normally pay for your taxis in advance and claim it back. They provide support workers. So I've worked with a solicitor a few years ago that actually found like carrying his heavy books to the courts was really quite difficult for him, and talking and writing was the same, you know, a difficulty. So he would have someone that would support him doing those bits. They've also got the mental health support in place now, the Maximus, where they will take you through like a structured program with some counselling and looking at some wellbeing at work and stuff like that. Or they will come in and do a workplace assessment and make recommendations for that. So the funding, they'll prescribe anything like, you know, if you were to be needing special software for your computer that is not ordinarily what the employers would give, they would fund that. But you know, you can be quite creative. I've had a landscape gardener that needed a 4-wheel terrain wheelchair, and that was funded for him, which was fabulous. So you know, just again thinking about what's needed, they can kind of explore that for you. If you're self-employed, they will fund 100%, and then it's a sliding scale, again, depending on the size of the organisation. If you've got to the point where you've identified your problems, you know what you need, and you've spoken to your employer about it, then it's really helpful to get a written record of that agreement. And that's because you might have a good relationship with your employer right now, but things might change in the future, like the employer might leave, or the workplace has got a reorganisation. So having that written record can be really helpful. Now, some employers have they might have a disability passport. I know, like in the MAD, they have that. But if your employer's like perhaps a startup company, they don't have these sorts of policies in place. The MS Society give a really nice structure to this kind of workplace adjustment agreement that you can just kind of go through that as well. Also, I would, if if your MS team are supportive and you're wanting to perhaps get some support around communicating some of your invisible reasonable adjustments, getting a letter from your MS team can really help with the understanding of that and the need for adjustments. And that's a big part of what we do at Queen Square, is writing to the employers, talking about like the impact of the invisible symptoms and what reasonable adjustments need to be in place. And where you've got that, then there's not perhaps as much of a requirement, because you've got that again written down for you. Moving on, if you are writing and agreeing kind of reasonable adjustments, I would recommend that you use your because you've asked us, how do you express what you need without looking like you're minimizing what you're wanting to do. So again, kind of talk about the adjustments as being kind of in a very positive way, of like, wow, you know, I can do this, this and this, but these things are challenging because of X, Y, Z. Therefore, if I put these adjustments in place, it will make me more efficient. So for example, if you're needing regular rest breaks, we know that people that experience fatigue do need regular rest breaks. And, you know, if you're starting to get tired and got brain fog, it can just it can be harder to work through things. Whereas if you're having more frequent rests, it can keep you going and sustain throughout the day. I would say to make your adjustments realistic. So just trying to think about it from the employer's side of things, but also be specific as well, so that there's little room for disagreement or misunderstanding. And I've talked about documenting them, but I would also encourage you to have those reviewed on a regular basis, maybe like yearly, and do that outside of your like appraisal that you might have at workplace, to just try and separate the two. Yeah, so moving on. Now, you've asked us these questions of, if you've got a lower immune system because you've got DMTs and your colleagues are coming into work and getting, you know, they're coming into work sick, and you're noticing you're getting yourself more sick, it could be reasonable to say, it depends on your job. If you can do your job from home, then you could be reasonable to say, you know what, if there's a period where say the winter flu period, lots of people are getting sick, you could have an agreement where you work from home during this time. Might not work if you're a teacher and you need to be amongst a group of sickly school children, because you still need to do your job. However, if you have a good job that you need to go in and need to be in person, and people are sick around you, and you notice that you're having more sick days than your colleagues, then you could look at increasing your sickness trigger points. Now, some employers have, particularly in the NHS, you know, they will have a system in place that say you can have 8 episodes of sickness per year, and if you breach those, then you're likely to be taken through the sickness management process. Now, that's not fair and not reasonable for someone that is on DMTs, that is more likely to make them sick. So you could then be asking that you have those sick days, your sickness trigger points increase, so that you're not then being performance managed because of that. We also had the question of, can you be terminated for taking time off treatment? No, and in actual fact, what I'd encourage you to do is to look at your policy in the workplace and to be asking for disability leave for treatment. Now, again, not all employers have it. Like if you work for the NHS or you work for local government, you can look at disability leave, and the NHS has got a whole web page on it for employers there. If your employers don't have that in place, then again, you might want to look at like having an increase in your sick days so that you can accommodate that, because you know you need to be put on a level playing field. And it's really important when we talk about that positive language that you're having treatment because this is keeping you and your, you know, this is keeping you well, and it's stopping your MS from progressing. So it's really important that you have this, and I would say get the backup of your medical team to write that letter for you, and don't really think carefully about taking annual leave for that type of thing. Yeah, so I'm coming to the close of my my part of my talk, but some really helpful resources here are ACAS. Don't know if anyone's heard that. If you have any disagreements or things aren't going very well for you, then ACAS stands for Advisory, Conciliation and Attribution Services. They've got a wealth of knowledge, resources and lots of templates. They've got a really helpful line that you can call. So that's always my go-to place. There's also the Disability Law Service, and they've got a lawyer funded for people with MS by the MS Society. So that's a really helpful one. Again, have a look at the MS Society website. They've got a really helpful page for employers and employees, the toolkit, so you could always kind of share some of that information. And the access to work, travel equipment, yeah, have a look at the access to work. And if you're in an organisation where you've got a union, then they're really helpful as well. So thank you. Passing back over to Blanca.
Thank you very much. Now, to conclude the presentation, I'm just going to present a quick overview of different research programs that have been conducting testing. So Joanne has gone through wide range of topics that can be addressed through this sort of vocational rehabilitation to support people to manage their MSR work and manage relationships. And I just wanted to illustrate that from the research perspective, there are programs that are being tested to see what works and for whom, because everyone is very different. And this working yet worried intervention is actually the basis of Joanne's service. It was conducted in the UK, in London, by Joanna Sweetland. She developed this program, and the idea is you first have an initial assessment to understand your experiences, identify some key goals, and develop a plan of what sort of support the person can receive. And in the original study, during 12 months, the person could receive 6 different treatment sessions on a range of topics that are relevant to supporting people in employment, like advice about fatigue, legal rights, disclosure, managing anxiety, liaising with employers. And at the end of the study, you will review the goals. And then if the person has met the goals, the person could have been discharged. Otherwise, they could have gone through a next round of support. Now, following from this study, in Nottingham, where I am based, we follow up on that program and continue understanding these sort of programs. And we have developed a program where we also do an initial interview to understand the personal, clinical, and employment circumstances of the person, assess the impact of MS at work, and identify 3 key goals that the person wants to achieve at work. And during 3 months, they can receive between 1 or 10 hours of support, because not everyone needs all of these hours. Some people may just need a couple hours of support to problem solve a certain situation or to address a query they may have, and others may have a wider range of topics to address. This was informed by people with MS, healthcare professionals, and employers. And again, you can see a long range of topics, many of them Joanne has addressed today, from legal rights, managing your symptoms, signposting to other organizations, for example, national charities or government schemes, and overall long-term career planning. So again, some people may not be able to remain in the same job, but they can move to a different role. They might be able to train and follow a career in a slightly different area that might allow them to continue employed for longer. Finally, I wanted to present this one because as a psychologist, I found it quite interesting. It's from the USA, this study, and they only included women, but it was a neuropsychological sort of intervention with a focus in work. So you conduct an assessment to understand the memory and thinking difficulties that the person with MS experience at work, and then they receive personalized support to overcome the difficulties in the context of work. And again, these are followed by follow-up calls where you double check what works and what doesn't, because many of the reasonable adjustments or the ideas around taking breaks we are all different, and for some people might prefer to take short breaks, other might need longer breaks. So you need to problem solve what sort of level of the adjustments work for you and what type of adjustments. And I think that's why Joanne mentioned you should review your reasonable adjustments, because they might work at the beginning, but you may need to change them if the condition changes or if you are managing it much better. So it's very important to just not remain using the same support, but assess over time whether it needs to be changed or if it's still being effective. And to conclude, again, these were the range of questions that we ask you, any doubts that you might have about working with MS. I hope we covered both all of these questions in the different parts of the presentation, but now we are happy to answer any questions that you may think of, and you may have seen the balloons on the slides. I'm not sure I moved them as well as I should have. But now we have a nice time for a brief discussion. And on behalf of Joanne and myself, I would like to say thank you so much, everyone, for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any questions, we are more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, Blanca. I'd also like to say thank you too.
Thank
Shall
you.
I stop?
Brilliant. Yeah, you go ahead and stop sharing if that's, yeah, perfect. Thank you both so much. That was so informative, and I think lots of people take lots of things away. So thank you. And we will be sharing a lot of the links that were shared today afterwards as well, via email. So yeah, if anyone does have any questions, we've got about 10 minutes left. So you both did really well for timing. So you can pop any questions in the chat. You can use our Slido if you prefer to ask anonymously, or feel free just to pop your virtual hand up as well. If you have any questions for Blanca or Joanne, I'll just check the Slido. Oh, we've got one. So what should I do if I'm nervous about disclosing about work and don't know who to contact locally?
Okay, so I'm just thinking, don't know who to contact locally in terms of with your MS team. I'm guessing you're thinking that. I would probably look to the MS Society chat first, and have a look at, go through, they've got some nice questions to be thinking about. So think about the who, what, why, and when. If you're thinking about disclosing, again, think about how you might phrase it. Practice what you're going to say so that it feels, write it down so that you feel like you get everything out, and you can say something like, I've got MS. It doesn't affect my performance at work. I'm known to a specialist MS team that look after me and can support me with this. I might just need a little bit of help with X, Y, Z if you've identified your reasonable adjustments, because I think that most employers are pretty supportive. And they might want to support you, but they don't know how to. So you giving them the answers of like, I think I could do my job better if I work from home 2 days a week. Yeah, I'm not sure if your specific question, your specific circumstances, but that's just a bit of an overview. But again, it is quite, talk about it with a family member as well, about the pros and cons for you and the industry that you work in.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jo. Any other questions from anyone?
Is it okay if I ask one? Sorry, I turned my camera on, but my children are running around in the back and you don't want to see that. I just wanted to ask if one of the adjustments that you want is in relation to the treatment that you're on rather than your condition. Is that something you're allowed? So my example is that I lose my voice. I've just had my Ocrevus infusion a week ago, and by the end of the day, I'm actually okay at the moment because I've had some voice rest today. But is voice rest something that you can ask for as a reasonable adjustment as a consequence of treatment?
Sorry, I didn't know if go for that one. Yes, I would definitely say so. I don't know your specific circumstances. Like, it might be a bit harder if you're a teacher. Is the talking all day quite an important part of your job?
Yeah, sorry, I work as a project manager and I work from home. So I have been quite lucky in being redeployed in my current role. I did have a lot of issues when I was first diagnosed, and I think a seminar like this would have been really useful back then, because I was kind of trying to figure out what to do. I am working from home. My employer has been very supportive with treatment and time off. It's just more when I've returned to work. I've not asked for it yet. It's only because you asked which questions and this one came up because it's quite fresh. So that's why I'm asking.
So I would definitely, I mean, you know, we routinely say people should not be having back-to-back meetings, and, you know, having voice rest, particularly when you've just had your treatment, is definitely something which could be considered reasonable if you are in ability where you're able to kind of plan and organise your week and your interactions with others. I can see, you know, why it shouldn't be supportive for you, especially if you're working from home.
Yeah, I was also going to add that to those circumstances that, again, in the context of telling to these circumstances to an employer, it's good to present what you are experiencing, but as well a solution next to it. So yours is quite time associated. So if it's after treatment, or for example, if it's always at the end of the day, propose, for example, I tend to have like infusions every 6 weeks or treatment every 6 weeks. And after I find that my voice varies a bit, so will it be possible to reorganize my schedule in such a way that I'm doing more the administrative emails or other work that doesn't involve to speak soon after the treatment, and then I will continue having the meetings as normal, but just know that I need 1 or 2 days after the treatment where I need to recover my voice to help me recover and speed up that recovery.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for that. It was because it was more related to my infusions rather than my MS at the moment, so I just thought I'd ask. Thank you so much.
I would definitely probably use them together because your infusions is about keeping you well with your MS.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, yeah.
It is part of the journey for you. So
thank you so much.
Louise?
I just wanted to make a comment if I can. So in my experience, I learned to just be mindful of what I shared. There are some colleagues who know that I have MS, and sometimes those colleagues, unfortunately, have made comments that they're not nasty, but they've just made simple comments that I didn't appreciate. So if I can just share my experience where I've learned to balance what you share. So obviously tell who is important and keep it, you know, and the amount of information that you share, sometimes you don't have to tell everything. You don't have to tell everybody all your symptoms and so on and so forth. I am fortunate to where I was able to switch careers. I was a hairstylist, and I was able to leave that industry after being diagnosed. And I'm now in a much better position. But in my experience, I found that sometimes the negative comments or the implied looks, the inferred reactions and things that were happening within the work environment actually made me question my performance at work. Whereas if I hadn't said anything, I probably wouldn't have noticed, but I was more aware that people knew that I had MS, which knocked my confidence. So just sort of like if I can give an advice, I guess it would be just to be mindful that you don't have to share everything, and you know, sometimes you can just tell the relevant person and then just go on with your job as normal, because some of those environmental factors can have a bigger impact than they may have if you hadn't mentioned it at all. If that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And thank you very much for sharing that, because it's true. I think not everyone understands MS. People with MS are very different. And sometimes people build their own puzzle. So you might be one day in one way, they might know another person with MS, and they might build a picture of what you can or cannot do on their mind based on their experiences, which does not necessarily align with your reality. So I think it's through what you share and to whom. You have to be mindful about that. And yes, sometimes I think explaining it in a basic level, because when you live with MS, you are an expert of MS, and in particular an expert of your own MS. But people might say they know what it is, but they don't really understand it. So if you go to a basic level and only explain what is relevant to the context of work, can be helpful to avoid people building up their own story of your circumstances, basically.
And I didn't actually put this in the presentation, but actually the ACAS website has some really nice examples of different types of discrimination, because it's quite hard, isn't it, to prove like those comments that you might feel like you're experiencing. But ACAS looks at, you know, there's direct discrimination where people are overtly, or there's like indirect. Certainly worked with somebody that had their away day was always very physical, like paintballing and stuff like that, and the employers knew about the MS, but it was very uninclusive of that individual, which again is indirect. So yeah, so if you feel like you might be, talk to ACAS, look at like the different descriptions and stuff like that. Hopefully it will never happen to you, but it's a good place to start if you do feel. And someone said thank you for sharing that, Louise, because someone said it really resonates as well. So it's great that you shared that, Louise.
Brilliant.
And I sorry, if you don't just, I found myself in a situation where I was almost making, I thought, should I just give up work? Because everybody thinks that I should. And so that negative environment made me question myself. And the attitudes had an impact and on my mental health in that respect. And I thought, well, because it's a defeatist attitude, isn't it? People think, oh, you've got MS, and they automatically assume you're not employed, and so on and so forth. So that all of the things that happened, it caused me to question whether I should stay in work. So I've actually, because I'm just a stubborn idiot anyway, I've just fought against it. But it's really important that we don't let those things influence us, because we're warriors at the end of the day. So
brilliant. What a nice way to end. Thank you, Louise. I think that's all we've got time for. We have managed to finish on time, which is great. I have posted a feedback form in the chat box as well. It literally takes 1 or 2 minutes maximum, and we'd really appreciate it, so we can do more events like this and hopefully make them as beneficial as possible for people. So if you could fill that out before you leave, that'd be amazing. And the recording will be available to watch afterwards if you want to go and find out more about anything that you might have forgotten or missed. That'll be on our YouTube channel. And like I said, I'll send an email over the next few days with all the links that were mentioned to ACAS, the Disability Law Services, the MS Society website, Access to Work, and I'll double check if there's anything else as well. But yeah, just a massive thank you again to Jo and Blanca, and to everyone for joining as well. Thank you so much. Bye, have a good evening.